Climate hysteria has taken over the world. Why is that, and who are behind this? Hi, my name is Per Strandberg, and I have a Master's of Science degree in Applied Physics, and I try here to answer this question. This part 2, is about the creation of the climate hysteria. Instrumental to this has been the Rockefeller family, together with politicians within the United Nations, and I will here show why and how. This is a story which few people in the public have ever heard about. Therefore, this is a story that needs to be told. Jacob Nordangård, a Swede who was a supporter of the Green Party, was working on a PhD on EU's biofuel mandate strategy. Then he asked if someone at the university knew how the global warming theory was discovered. He got an article from someone on how all this started. While reading this article, he discovered that Rockefeller Funds was involved in financing initial meetings. But wait, wasn't Rockefeller profiting from oil while they had monopoly via the Standard Oil Company? And have not Rockefeller still strong interest in the oil industry? It should make no sense for Rockefeller to fund research in something that could kill the oil industry. That was one thing he asked himself. How could this be? So he started to investigate this and to seek answers to why Rockefeller was promoting research, this theory that fossil fuel would change the climate. Rockefeller keep good bookkeeping of all their business venture and keep their records open without hiding their data. Note, what is presented here is no conspiracy theory, as this information is from the Rockefeller records directly. I add in the description of this video 2 videos with Jacob Nordangård that describes how Rockefeller was involved in creating this scare. About 120 years ago, the owner of Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, was the richest man in the world. After the breakup of Standard Oil just before the First World War, which was caused by antitrust legislation in the U.S., the main emphasis of the Rockefellers came to be after that oil, banking, and philanthropy. Philanthropy is the term for charity given by rich foundations or persons that are paid out for good purposes. At least that is the main idea. Chase Manhattan Bank is Rockefeller's bank. One important thing to add here is their big investments in universities and in academic research. One strategy they often use on controversial issues are to fund both sides. So what are Rockefeller's main objectives? Answer: they want more power. They want more control, and they want to make more money. Although the money part is not the main thing. Ultimately, they want global governance, which is the buzzword for a global government. The Rockefeller have been engaged in the medical industries, eugenics. They want to limit world population, protection from nuclear wars, protection of natural resources. They want to own resources by themselves. They use environmentalism and humans' influence on weather as a tool to reach their goals. By working for global government and international legislations, democracy is eroded. Multinational, globalist corporations and large banks are benefiting. The big investment banks on Wall Street make most of their profits from trading on the stock market. Recent technical improvements in AI, artificial intelligence, have made this profitable for the big players, including the Rockefellers. I included an interview between James Delingpole and Patrick Wood on this, which is called Technocracy. The Rockefellers and other super-rich globalists had identified environmentalism and climate change as a tool to use to reach their goal of global governance and the breakdown of democracies. They try to convince ordinary people to give up liberties for the common good, using fear like species loss or fear of dangerous human-caused climate change. Could do the trick for them. I had a video by George Hunt that was made just before the UN Environmental Conference at Rio in 1992 from the Fourth World Wilderness Congress, which describes how environmental movements and global warming are the main tools to be used to take over more of the world by global financial elite. Rockefeller's involvement in the environment and climate change movements have a long history. The environmental movement can be said to have started by Rachel Carson with her book Silent Spring in the mid-1960s. She was supported by Rockefeller. She warned that pesticides were killing birds, insects, and caused cancer in humans. This book led to the banning of DDT. The result of the banning of DDT caused excessive death from malaria of mostly children in Africa over the following decades. The Club of Rome, a very influential think tank with connection to the UN, was formed in 1968 at a meeting in David Rockefeller's house in Bellagio, Italy, with Ariel Pesce, an industrialist from Fiat. In their first book, Limit of Growth, they made a prediction based on a computer model that the Earth would collapse because of pollution and lack of natural resources around the year 2020. How the global warming agenda became a UN agenda. A conference was held in 1979 called World Climate Conference that was organized by the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. They discussed if humans had an important effect on Earth climate but came to no conclusion. In 1985, an important conference was held in the town of Villach, Austria, on the assessment of the role of carbon dioxide and of other greenhouse gases in climate variations and associated impacts. Maurice Strong, UNEP, UN Environmental Program, and World Meteorological Organization, WMO, contributed to the conference. Rockefeller was a financial contributor to the conference. The main aim of the conference was to make the potential risk of human-caused warming, which some scientists then believed, from a scientific question into a political question connected to the UN and to the many UN organizations to work as the main promoters. Two influential persons that have been active for promoting the Rockefeller global warming agenda were Maurice Strong and Henry Kissinger. Margaret Thatcher had a bachelor degree in chemistry. She found that the global warming theory was good for promoting nuclear power and to stop the coal miners. She later changed her mind of global warming after she had left as Prime Minister. Another important event was when James Hansen had a hearing in the Congress on the warmest day of the year in 1988. He was an important scientist that promoted the dangerous global warming theory and later became the director of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, GISS, which monitor temperature based on weather stations. He made several predictions on global warming. None of these have ever come true. IPCC was formed in 1988, and its first head was the Swedish meteorologist Bert Bolin. Bert Bolin was often a sparring partner in tennis to the Swedish Socialist Prime Minister Olof Palme. They knew each other since their time in school. Palme regularly exercised by playing tennis. The first UN Environmental Conference was held in 1972 in Stockholm, which was held by Maurice Strong. I'm sure that Olof Palme opened doors for Bert Bolin into the UN system and promoted his ideas of human-caused global warming caused by increase of CO2. IPCC deliver reports on human impacts on climate. They are divided into three parts. Working Group 1 is the Physical Science Report. Working Group 2 is on Socioeconomic and on Nature. Working Group 3 is on mitigation of climate change. I will here concentrate in Working Group 1, which is on the science. The Working Group 1 document contains thousands of pages, but the important part contains less than 50 pages and is supposedly a compilation of the main report. It is called Summary for Policymakers. This is what politicians and journalists read and is full of alarmism. Its content is often contradicting from the main science report. The procedure of making these reports is as follows. Many scientists are involved in the making of the reports. The key scientists are called lead authors. The lead authors are often ideological connected to activist organizations such as Greenpeace and WWF. Each lead author gets special individual topics to cover for the main report. They then work together with other authors in the field through the internet. Each chapter is based on peer-reviewed literature, or at least it is supposed to be based on peer-reviewed literature, but this is not always the case. The lead authors have the last word, and if there is something they don't like, they can just dismiss this information. The lead authors get together even before the main report is ready and write what is called summary for policy makers, which is some kind of executive summary that are distributed to journalists and politicians. Then diplomats, environmental bureaucrats, and the lead authors get together and haggle sentence for sentence during a few days in a closed room and rewrite the summary for policymakers' document, which then are distributed to the public with great fanfares. So, activist scientists, diplomats, and environmental bureaucrats that are dependent on the climate scare for their livelihood put together this document. This has nothing to do with scientific procedure, according to me. It is a way to produce propaganda and not anything else. Maurice Strong was the man that set up this procedure surrounding the IPCC reports. I have a link with Donna Laframboise's interview, who has researched IPCC and that has revealing information on this. The first IPCC report came out in 1990 when Bert Boland was the head of the IPCC. The first report didn't contain alarmism. The following reports became over time more and more alarmist, especially the summary report for policymakers, while the main reports contained more credible science. The Brundtland Commission came out in 1985 and was called Our Common Future. Gro Harlem Brundtland was a socialist prime minister of Norway and worked with Maurice Strong, who was then the head of UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. This report was to a large extent financed by Rockefeller and proposed a globalist rationing system on the basis of the new term of sustainability and a new socialist global economic order. The word sustainability has become a key marketing and triggering word for promotion of the UN globalist agenda. This report was the brainchild for the establishment of the UN's Agenda 21, which was adopted at the UN's Environmental Conference at Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The aim of Agenda 21 was to apply globalist agenda at a local level worldwide. This agenda was upgraded by the UN in collaboration with the World Economic Forum in 2015 into what they called Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development. Agenda 2030 contains 17 Sustainable Development Goals. On the surface, it looks like a smorgasbord of good intentions, but looking closer, and one finds a deep political socialist agenda. The most important underlining goal is to stop climate change, which is, as we now know, is mostly natural and cannot therefore be stopped. If you are working in a public sector, then you are likely to have attended seminars on Agenda 2030. Of course, you can't question why. What's the reason for this, and why all the rush? They can't give answers for those questions. In 2020, during the COVID epidemic, Klaus Schwab, the leader of World Economic Forum, introduced the Great Reset and wrote a book that the COVID epidemic was a great opportunity for the introduction of the Great Reset. What the Great Reset is all about is to replace the capital system with a new economic system in favor of what they call a stakeholder economic system, which promote a woke economic liberal agenda. The stakeholders are supposed to be you and me, but in reality it's the super rich and multinational companies that are gaining more power from this. The main tool for this transformation is the COVID epidemic and the claim of climate change. By driving policies to meet these mostly invented problems, they can create hyperinflation, which risk to create deep depression and economic collapse. In deep economic crisis, investors with money can buy up real estate and companies on the cheap. Klaus Schwab looked like a villain in a James Bond movie that want to conquer the world, but this is for real and not fiction. He also writes about what he calls transhumanism. The goal is to create a globalist-controlled society for the globalist elite, where people live without cars and without private property. They hate urban sprawl and want people instead to live in mega cities in small apartments. This is what they call smart cities. I have to stress here that UN, with Agenda 2030 and the Great Reset that was launched by the World Economic Forum, is not hidden agenda, but easily accessible on their own websites. Politicians do not normally use the term the Great Reset for the Great Reset. They use the slogan Build Back Better. but it is the same political agenda as the Great Reset. A second report was produced in 1995. During the third version of the IPCC's report of 2001, one important lead author was a fresh PhD with the name of Michael Mann. He was able to plaster his hockey stick temperature graph all over the summary for policymakers' report. The hockey stick temperature graph during the last 2,000 years shows static temperature and not changing except from the year 1900, after which it has increased sharply. This is a fraudulent graph that was used to promote the idea that recent temperature increase has been unusual. The fourth IPCC report came out in 2007. I saw on BBC a press conference from Paris where Susan Solomon and Rajendra Pachauri, the then head of IPCC, when they presented the summary for policymakers for Working Group 1. Susan Solomon is an atmospheric scientist that researched the predecessor of the global warming agenda, which is known as the UN Montreal Protocol, which led to the global freon banning in order to protect the ozone layer. I'm agnostic on the effectiveness of the Montreal Protocol. However, the UN now, use the same playbook when it comes to global warming and CO2. Stop using freon is one thing, banning of using fossil fuel is quite another thing. During this press conference, there were 2 times when extraordinary things happened. One was when the audience gave big applause and hooray calls when Pachauri proclaimed that we were entering soon a time of climate catastrophes. The audience were mostly composed of environment and climate journalists. Climate journalists belong to a new profession whose livelihood is to write climate scare stories for the news media. This fourth IPCC report of the summary for policymakers was in fact a go-ahead for the other IPCC reports of Working Group 2 and 3 to adopt the worst possible climate projections. This was also a trigger for the go-ahead to activate the financial industries and to influence leading politicians to take the climate scare theory seriously. The other thing I saw was when Susan Solomon leaned over to Rajendra Pachauri, whispering to him if we should tell them that the sea temperature around Antarctica hasn't warmed up, contradicting the global warming theory. He said no to that. This didn't belong to the agenda. Michael Mann's hockey stick graph in later reports was removed. It is now nowhere to be found. Around 2007, the film The Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore came out, and at the same time, the TV program The Great Global Warming Swindle, that is critical of the climate scare, came out too. Apart from IPCC, there is another important UN organization called United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. They have organized yearly COP conferences since 1995. COP stands for Conference of the Parties and are yearly trade shows for the climate industry, environmental organizations, and various NGOs. Plus, world leaders meet there and are there one day talking and then travel back home. After that, environmental bureaucrats and diplomats put together a document after late nightly discussions which often demand rich countries to transfer money to poor countries based on the idea that developed countries somehow create bad weather in poor countries. 2 COP meetings were especially important. COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, and COP21 in Paris in 2015. COP21 in Paris led to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is an agreement to keep global temperature increase since 1880 under 2 degrees Celsius or hopefully below 1.5 degrees Celsius, alleging that CO2 increase is the main temperature driver on Earth. The plan was that this agreement would have been agreed on at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. One reason that this didn't happen in Copenhagen was because of ClimateGate. ClimateGate was a collection of emails collected by Phil Jones, which was exposed on the internet. These emails showed without any doubt that a small group of leading climate scientists were more activists than scientists. They tried to block scientists that didn't have an alarming view from publishing in scientific journals, and to exclude them from the scientific community. They took over peer-reviewed journals. They manipulated climate data. Many people before ClimateGate started to ask questions about the dangerous global warming theory. Where is the evidence? A couple of skeptical Canadian researchers, statistician Stephen McIntyre and economist Ross McKittrick, wanted to get the data that Michael Mann's hockey stick was based on. This research was based on public money, and because of the Freedom of Information Act, the data on which the hockey stick was based on should have been accessible to others to look at. Michael Mann refused, claiming that this was his private data. They also wanted to view Phil Jones' email conversations. Jones was advised by lawyers to keep his email data separate on a server. Someone internally, probably inside of East Anglia University where Phil Jones worked, sent out these emails on a Russian server which was released right before the Copenhagen climate meeting COP15. There has been big efforts to engage every UN organization in the promotion of global warming theory, and there are large numbers of other organizations such as NGOs, think tanks, lobby, and environmental organizations that are often financed by very rich people that promote dangerous human-caused global warming alarmism, often with money from Rockefeller, from the UN, and from the EU. One example of Rockefeller funding has been for 350.org run by Bill McKibben. The latest version of the IPCC report, the sixth assessment report with the summary for policymakers, has been ratcheted up with scare stories. Similar graphs to the Michael Mann's hockey stick temperature graph have been emerged from the dead, and they claim that there is now evidence that the number of extreme weather events have increased, despite the fact that stormy weather decreases if global temperature increases. UN and IPCC have used several reports within its organization to scare people. There was a meeting in 2016 in Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda. There, they decided to stop the use of hydrofluorocarbons in refrigerators with what is called the Kigali Amendment. Freon was banned to be used in refrigerator in what is called the Montreal Protocol, as it was believed this was destroying the ozone layer which protect us from ultraviolet radiation. Hydrofluorocarbons is a greenhouse gas, and the banning of that was declared as a great victory because they claimed they stopped a future warming of up to 0.5 degrees Celsius. They claimed so, in fact, they just guessed with the highest value they could come up with. The congregation of people at that meeting in Kigali consisted of the usual UN people, activists, scientists, climate bureaucrats. Most importantly, they all got a holiday trip with the possibility of safari trips and the possibility to visit wild mountain gorillas. In 2018, a special IPCC report came out on a coral reef. At 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase from pre-industrial levels, then 70 to 90% of all coral reef is expected to die. And if this increase is 2.0 degrees Celsius, then nearly all coral reef is going to die. That's what they claimed, okay? What's wrong with that picture? For one, tropical reef exists only in tropical waters, and if Earth's global temperature increases, then one would expect more coral reefs to exist, not less. Also, temperature variations in the tropics are small and depend more on El Niño and La Niña variations in the tropical Pacific Oceans than that of global temperature change. Tropical reefs can exist in a temperature range from 18 to 35 degrees Celsius, and you can find these temperature changes in the Persian Gulf, which is a shallow body of water that lacks deep cold water. Often, they refer to the Great Barrier Reef outside of Australia as an example of a dying reef. It is constantly dying, according to scientists. While the temperature on the Great Barrier Reef is normally about 24 to 26 degrees Celsius, the temperature north of New Guinea is about 28 to 30 degrees, and the type of corals are the same as you find on the Great Barrier Reef. Surprisingly now, in 2022, after a long period of La Niña, the amounts of healthy corals at the Great Barrier Reef are now at record levels. Professor Peter Ridd worked at James Cook University in Queensland. He did quality controls on coral bleaching, which didn't show that the reef was dying. This resulted in complaints from other scientists as being unsolidaric toward other scientists that were more alarmistic toward climate impact on the reef. Peter Ridd got fired because of his work. In other words, James Cook University was more interested in the income for the university while protecting coral reef researchers than to protect academic freedom or losing funds for the university. Peter Ridd explains that most scientists in this field truly believe that coral reefs are in peril and that to question this is a threat to their profession. IPBES, which stand for Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is another UN organization which structure is based on how IPCC function. A former head of the IPCC, Robert Watson, has also been the head of IPBES. IPBES is an intergovernmental UN organization that tries to scare people and politicians that animal and plant species are currently experiencing a sixth mass extinction, which, of course, a ridiculous claim. If you ask the people involved in IPBES if they know any species that has gone extinct, they probably can't give you any answer. Large extinctions that have killed large numbers of animals and plants have occurred many times in Earth's history. The two most famous mass extinctions were the KT boundary, when the dinosaurs got extinct 65 million years ago, and the Permian extinction 250 million years ago. Nature is resilient, and yes, monoculture and expansion of human habitat cause stress for nature, but to compare this with these mass extinction events are just silly. And then they just ignore the extinctions caused by recent ice ages. They also forget to mention the extinction of large animals in the Americas 12,900 years ago during the Younger Dryas events, which was probably caused by multiple comet impacts. There are always claims of 10 years left before an ecological catastrophe happens. Here is an example from year 1972 when Maurice Strong met the Swedish agricultural minister in preparation for the upcoming UN's first environmental conference in Stockholm. In the headline of the article it says, translated from Swedish, UN environmental head warns, we have 10 years to stop the catastrophe. There have been continuous streams of environmental and climate scare ever since this forecast. I have a link to a video showing that. Why do these scare stories been told over and over again? And why do we not find any criticism of this in the media? An elite of financial, political, and academic elite are trying to take over more power and control. It makes it easier for them if people are scared. Then people accept giving away power more easily. The goals for the elites are to erode property rights and democracy bit by bit over time, and to get more richer and to create a global government. I have video on what the World Economic Forum and the UN are up to. Very interesting and scary. To summarize what this video is all about, the Rockefellers, the main promoter of the dangerous human-caused global warming theory, wanted to create more power and control for the financial, political, and academic elite. This has been made possible by their influence over the UN. Super-rich philanthropies identified environment crisis and climate change as something that people, politicians, and journalists could be manipulated to believe in using emotions and repetitions. As Rockefeller was the biggest private sponsor of academic research in the US, the amount of sponsor money in climate science increased at the end of the 1980s many times over, but only for researchers that showed that man-made increase in greenhouse gases was causing dangerous global warming. This made it very attractive to environmental-inclined graduate students to study climate. If you were a graduate student that wanted to research the greatest threat to Earth or to the climate and to become a hero, wouldn't you do that? Problem is that there is no evidence for human-caused climate catastrophe. And also, there was a lot of money in this field. These researchers managed to take control of the peer review process, changing it from a quality tool to a tool for protecting the narrative and to their current groupthink. Rockefeller and other finance experts know about marketing, branding, and how human psychology work, and that climate scare was the perfect target for such efforts. It is important that you watch the other videos which I link to, which complement this video. If you like this video, you can also sponsor it via PayPal. See also Part 1, which describes the science.